Good afternoon, everyone. Today we are going to dive into the story of one of the longest and most tragic wars of the 20th century, the Afghan War, which left a deep mark not only in history, but also in global politics. It fundamentally changed the balance of power between world powers, contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and plunged Afghanistan into chaos for many years. But think about what would have happened if things had gone differently. What if key decisions had been made in a completely different way, and the result would have been different from what we know today? What if the USSR had radically changed its strategy at a crucial moment? In this article, we will try to imagine an alternative scenario in which events would have taken a different course. But first, let's take a look back at what actually happened. The Afghan War began in 1979, when the Soviet Union decided to send in troops to support the pro-Soviet government, which was trying to hold on to power after the Saur Revolution. However, local rebels, the Mujahideen, quickly took the path of resistance, and not alone. They were actively supported by the United States, Pakistan, and other countries. The war quickly turned into a grueling guerrilla conflict in the mountains, where every day was a struggle for life. Despite their technical superiority, Soviet troops failed to win a decisive victory. They were weakened not only by the Mujahideen, but also by internal economic and political problems. Eventually, in 1989, the USSR began to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan, which actually meant the defeat and fall of the pro-Soviet regime in the country. But let's imagine that the Soviet Union would not have withdrawn in 1985. Instead, it would have radically changed its strategy. In this alternative scenario, events unfold differently. After coming to power, Mikhail Gorbachev quickly realizes that the prolonged military intervention in Afghanistan has exhausted itself and is only making things worse. The war was consuming more and more resources, and the losses were becoming too great, provoking public discontent that put pressure on the government. The economic cost of the conflict is becoming unbearable for a country already suffering from other Cold War fronts. Gorbachev realizes that continuing the war according to the old scenarios threatens to drag the conflict out indefinitely, especially as the US and China's support for the Mujahideen grows. In order to avoid further weakening the Soviet Union, he decides to take a different path. Instead of starting a withdrawal of troops, as happened in reality, Gorbachev relies on the use of the latest technologies, such as drones and satellite reconnaissance. This allows for more efficient operations with minimal losses. In addition, he sees a threat in the radicalization of the Mujahideen and understands that without negotiations with moderate forces, the conflict risks turning into an endless confrontation with no prospects for peace. To avoid further deepening of the conflict, Gorbachev embarks on active diplomatic negotiations with Pakistan and other neighboring countries. He also agreed with the United States to secretly limit arms supplies to the Mujahideen, opening the way for dialogue with moderate leaders. This allows the Soviet Union to gradually shift from exhausting warfare to more controlled and strategic tactics, reducing the burden on the economy and military resources. He chooses several key areas. First, he initiates a large-scale reform of the army, engaging leading Soviet scientists and military strategists to develop new methods of warfare in the Afghan mountains. The main focus is on improving intelligence and information gathering, as the Mujahideen have a significant advantage due to their deep knowledge of the terrain and maneuverability. Gorbachev relies on the use of the latest satellite technology, drones, and specialized reconnaissance groups. Secondly, the Soviet Union creates new units specialized in fighting Mujahideen guerrilla forces. These are light mobile units that move quickly even in the most difficult mountainous areas. Experienced special services instructors are involved in their training, as well as new types of weapons specially designed for such conditions. The USSR turned to its scientific and technological complex to develop innovative systems to combat guerrilla movements. The strategies employed at the beginning of the war did not take into account the difficult mountainous terrain and guerrilla warfare methods. Soviet troops often suffered from logistical problems, ambushes, and a lack of understanding of local conditions. Instead of traditional heavy armored vehicles, light drones are being actively used for reconnaissance and targeted strikes on enemy positions. This makes it possible to conduct operations in the mountains with minimal losses. Inspired by the success of the space program, engineers are creating satellite systems to monitor and coordinate troops on the ground. The use of these satellites greatly hampers the movement of the Mujahideen, reducing their advantages to a minimum. The new weapons include light automatic grenade launchers and portable missile systems with high accuracy, capable of quickly destroying fortified positions. Sniper rifles with a long range are also being introduced, giving them an advantage in mountainous terrain. Silent pistols and automatic rifles are becoming indispensable for covert operations and ambushes. Although microdrones are still in experimental development, they are already being used to gather intelligence and identify hidden Mujahideen bases. Most importantly, Gorbachev completely changed his approach to diplomacy. Instead of relying solely on the power of the army, he actively begins negotiations with neighboring countries, including Pakistan and Iran, to isolate the Mujahideen from external assistance. A compromise is reached with Pakistan thanks to the intervention of the United States. Both sides agree to close key arms supply channels for the rebels. In exchange, the Soviet Union provides Pakistan with certain economic benefits and promises political support in the international arena. However, a secret deal with the United States becomes the decisive moment. Gorbachev realized that without American involvement, his influence on the Mujahideen would be insufficient, as the United States was the main supplier of weapons and finance to the Afghan insurgents. In secret negotiations with the U.S. administration, Gorbachev makes significant concessions. He proposes to reduce the Soviet military presence in other areas of the Cold War, such as Latin America and Africa, where U.S. interests are particularly important. In particular, the Soviet Union pledges to reduce its support for Cuba and Central America, which significantly reduces the USSR's activity in these regions and creates more favorable geopolitical conditions for Washington. This decision of the USSR leads to serious changes in the world. The decline in military support weakened communist movements in Latin America and Africa. Cuba, which had been dependent on Soviet aid, began to face economic difficulties and was forced to reduce its support for revolutionary movements in the region. For example, the communist rebels in Nicaragua are left without the necessary assistance and weaken over time. The impact of these changes is also being felt in Africa. The decline in support from the Soviet Union is weakening communist forces in countries such as Angola and Ethiopia, allowing their opponents, who often had Western support, to gain an advantage. The United States in particular is using this moment to strengthen its position and stabilize the situation in the region. As a result, this redistribution of Soviet resources from Latin America and Africa to Afghanistan allowed the United States to gradually increase its influence in these regions. At the same time, Gorbachev was able to focus the Soviet Union's efforts on Afghanistan, reduce military pressure on several fronts, and improve relations with the United States at a crucial time. In response to these concessions, the United States agreed to reduce its assistance to the Mujahideen. The Americans significantly reduced the amount of arms and funding for the Afghan insurgents and put pressure on their regional allies, in particular on Pakistan, which played a key role in supporting the Mujahideen. This forces the Pakistani authorities to seek a compromise with the USSR. An agreement was reached with Pakistan, according to which both sides agreed to close the main arms supply channels through Pakistani territory. This secret deal with the U.S. thus becomes a key element of Gorbachev's diplomatic strategy. It not only reduces the supply of weapons and support to the Mujahideen, but also weakens their morale, as the insurgents no longer have as much support as before. As a result of this multi-level diplomatic game, the USSR managed to limit the influence of external forces on the Afghan conflict, creating the preconditions for the gradual weakening of the Mujahideen. In parallel, Gorbachev began to work inside Afghanistan. He expands his dialogue with local leaders, offering the regions greater autonomy and the inclusion of moderate opposition forces in the government. This helps to gain support among the Afghan population and reduce the number of hostile groups. Another unexpected step was the rapprochement of the Soviet Union with China. In this scenario, instead of continuing cold relations due to ideological differences, Gorbachev realizes that new allies are needed to successfully end the war in Afghanistan. He offers China economic and military cooperation. For China, this rapprochement also has significant benefits. First, Beijing seeks to stabilize the region, as its western borders are adjacent to Afghanistan, and continued instability in the neighboring country threatens China's internal security. Guerrilla warfare in Afghanistan is leading to refugee flows, arms smuggling and drug trafficking, which threatens border provinces such as Xinjiang. Beijing fears that the Mujahideen ideology could fuel instability among China's Muslim minorities. Second, a rapidly developing China was interested in new economic ties with the USSR. Gorbachev offers lucrative economic deals, including access to Soviet resources such as oil and gas. In turn, China actively helps the USSR in Afghanistan, which becomes a favorable deal for both sides. Military cooperation also plays an important role. China provides the Soviet Union with intelligence on the border and is working together to create a security zone along the Pakistani border through which the Mujahideen receive weapons. This becomes an important element in maintaining the secret agreement with the United States, as it allows the USSR to hide the fact that it is reducing the supply of weapons to the Mujahideen. Pakistan, in turn, argues in international negotiations that its influence on the situation is limited because China is blocking supplies. The Chinese army has been increasing its presence on the border with Pakistan, regularly patrolling and blocking key mountain passes used by the Mujahideen to smuggle weapons. This military diplomatic partnership not only reduces the flow of weapons, but also increases political pressure on Pakistan, which is already in a difficult position due to the terms of the agreement with the USSR. Thanks to this cooperation, control over the border areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan is significantly strengthened. The Chinese military, along with Soviet forces, are using the latest intelligence technologies and setting up border posts, making it much more difficult for the Mujahideen to get supplies through mountainous routes. Improved intelligence allows them to quickly identify smuggling routes and block them, which significantly reduces the flow of weapons, money, and fighters from Pakistan. In addition, China is helping the USSR to put economic pressure on Pakistan through diplomatic channels, which further limits the Pakistani authorities' support for the Mujahideen. For the Soviet Union, this cooperation with China was a real strategic breakthrough. The Mujahideen can no longer receive aid unhindered across the Pakistani border and lose their main supply channels. The presence of Chinese troops on the border acts as a powerful deterrent to Pakistan, preventing it from actively supporting the insurgents. This cooperation helps the USSR to significantly reduce the influence of external forces on the course of the war, which gradually weakens the Mujahideen and forces them to reconsider their tactics of warfare. By 1988, the war in Afghanistan was changing dramatically. Thanks to the joint actions of the USSR and China, as well as secret agreements with the United States, the Mujahideen no longer receive stable external support. The supply of weapons and ammunition through Pakistan is virtually stopped, which critically weakens the insurgent forces. Without a steady flow of resources, many Mujahideen units are beginning to lose combat power, and internal discord and disputes over further actions are growing. Some field commanders refuse to actively fight, realizing that without external assistance their chances of victory are significantly reduced. During this period, the Soviet Union not only improved its military operations with the latest technology and drones, but also actively used diplomacy. Gorbachev relies on reaching a compromise with moderate Mujahideen leaders, offering them participation in the political process in exchange for a cessation of hostilities. Some of the leaders, tired of the war, agreed to negotiate with the Soviet government, entering into coalition agreements with the pro-Soviet government of Afghanistan. Soviet diplomacy gradually promotes a split among the Mujahideen. Some units continue to resist, but many moderate commanders, realizing that further fighting without external support is doomed to failure, are beginning to look for ways to negotiate. Local ceasefire agreements between Soviet troops and individual rebel groups allow the USSR to strengthen its position gradually and cautiously. Although full control of Afghanistan was not achieved, the Soviet Union achieved an important political success, an agreement with some moderate Mujahideen leaders who are beginning to cooperate with the government. This helps to create a new balance of power in a country where Soviet influence remains strong, but a path to stabilization through political agreements is opening up. These agreements resulted in a conditional ceasefire. Afghanistan remains under the control of the pro-Soviet government, but the regions retain broad autonomy for local leaders. The USSR manages to avoid economic collapse while maintaining its position in the international arena, and at the same time creates a new model of guerrilla warfare that it will use in other conflicts. Despite political agreements and a partial settlement, the situation in Afghanistan remains complex. The country is turning into a hybrid of military control and political compromise, with different regions enjoying broad autonomy, but remaining under the influence of both the pro-Soviet government and moderate insurgents. Some Mujahideen are integrating into the political system, but radical groups continue guerrilla warfare, especially in mountainous and rural areas, maintaining a state of constant tension. However, thanks to the government's cooperation with moderate leaders, Afghanistan is beginning a slow process of stabilization. Regions where agreements with the insurgents are working most effectively are able to gradually rebuild infrastructure. Local leaders are gaining autonomy over governance and security, enabling them to establish administrations that enjoy the trust of the local population. This helps to revive economic and social processes that were severely damaged during the war. Afghanistan is becoming a buffer zone, where Soviet troops remain present only in limited areas, and the main control belongs to local groups. The Soviet Union continues to provide economic and military assistance to the government, but the main conflict is now internal, a struggle between regional leaders to maintain their autonomy. The international impact of the situation in Afghanistan has significant geopolitical implications. First, the USSR retains its influence in Central Asia through agreements with some of the Mujahideen and its permanent presence in the region. However, Afghanistan is no longer just a Cold War battleground. Thanks to the agreements with the US and China, the conflict is losing its global significance, which reduces tensions between the superpowers. For the United States, the agreement was an example of successful diplomacy, where it was able to avoid direct intervention while maintaining its prestige. Although the United States has reduced military support for the Mujahideen, it has made major concessions to the Soviet Union in other regions, particularly in Latin America. The U.S. administration sees this as a tactical victory. It has reduced the cost of supporting the insurgency while maintaining control over key regions. China, in turn, raised its status in the international arena by participating in the settlement of the Afghan conflict. It has strengthened its borders by avoiding instability in Xinjiang and has reaped economic benefits from cooperation with the USSR. While the Soviet Union was focused on Afghanistan, China used this opportunity to increase its influence in neighboring regions and strengthen its economic potential. Thanks to these diplomatic maneuvers, the balance of power in the world began to change. Although the Soviet Union retained its influence in Afghanistan, it could not avoid economic exhaustion. The war was becoming less intense, but the need to support the Afghan government and military presence in the region put considerable pressure on the Soviet economy. Contradictions were growing in the Soviet Union itself. Dissatisfaction with the war among the population was growing, which only exacerbated internal crises. Initially presented as a quick military operation, the war gradually turned into a futile conflict that drained the country. Constant casualties among soldiers and reports of senseless fighting caused public outrage. Criticism was particularly active on the part of intellectuals and youth movements, which demanded an end to the war, seeing Afghanistan as another failure of Soviet policy. Families of fallen soldiers, known as Afghans, became one of the most critical groups, demanding explanations from the government about the meaning of the war. Protests and discontent from veterans returning home, with significant physical and psychological trauma added to the tension. The deteriorating economic situation made the war even less popular, as resources were spent on the conflict rather than on domestic needs. Against the backdrop of these internal problems, Gorbachev's reforms, perestroika and glasnost, did not produce the expected results. External and internal difficulties were closely linked. The concessions made in Latin America and other regions undermined the Soviet Union's prestige as a global superpower, further aggravating the situation. This forced the Soviet Union to rethink its foreign policy, focusing resources on maintaining strategically important territories such as Afghanistan. However, this did not ease tensions at home. However, the ongoing instability in Afghanistan did not allow the Soviet Union to fully distract itself from this conflict, which continued to take away resources needed in other strategic areas. In the 1990s, the USSR increasingly felt the effects of the prolonged economic and military burden, which eventually led to its collapse, albeit somewhat later than it actually happened. In the years following the agreement, Afghanistan remained a zone of local conflicts. Regions continue to retain broad autonomy, leading to periodic clashes between different groups of influence. The Afghan government remains weak and dependent on external support, especially from the USSR, which provides both economic and military assistance. At the same time, radical groups continue to operate in remote regions, which poses a constant threat to stability in the country. Due to its geographical isolation and limited resources, Afghanistan is not becoming a full-fledged state with a centralized government. The long-term autonomy of regional leaders makes the country vulnerable to external influences, and it remains a battleground for various interests. Although Afghanistan does not face the devastating civil war that erupted after the Soviet withdrawal in real history, stability remains fragile, and conflicts between tribes and political factions continue to erupt from time to time. Thus, the alternative outcome of the war in Afghanistan allowed the Soviet Union to maintain its influence in the region for several years longer, but it led to new challenges for the USSR and Afghanistan. The global balance of power was shifting, and although the collapse of the Soviet Union did not come abruptly in 1991, internal problems continued to grow, gradually leading to a crisis. The alternate scenario of the Afghan war we explored today allows us to dive into the possible consequences for the Soviet Union and global politics. As we've seen, even with significant diplomatic success, technological advancements, a strong alliance with China, and temporary victories on the battlefield, the war in Afghanistan would have left deep scars on both the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. The military and economic pressure would have inevitably led to ongoing internal instability and tension within the country. Although, in this scenario, the Soviet Union's collapse occurred later, the prolonged conflict could not prevent the economic crisis and political destabilization. Additionally, even though Afghanistan did not experience the full-scale civil war seen in reality, it still would have struggled to achieve full stability due to the long-term autonomy of regional leaders and outside interference. This leaves us wondering if the Soviet leadership could have taken a different path in real history, and if that would have changed the fate of not only Afghanistan but the entire world. The alternative history of the Afghan war offers a moment to reflect on the impact of political decisions and their influence on global dynamics. Wars, regardless of their scale, leave lasting effects not only on military operations but also on society, the economy, and international relations. The Soviet Union, like other superpowers, faced difficult choices, and as we see, those choices could have led to different outcomes, though the final consequences would still have been significant. If you enjoyed this analysis and the alternate perspective on the Afghan war, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more intriguing content. Leave your comments below. What would you have done if you were in the Soviet leadership's shoes in such a situation? Do you think technological advancements in diplomacy could have turned the tide of the war in the USSR's favor? And don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay updated with new videos.